Story number 1. Whispers Behind the Glass. I never believed in ghosts. Growing up in the bustling heart of Chicago, surrounded by the relentless hum of city life, the idea of spirits lingering in the shadows seemed more like a page out of a horror novel than reality. But when my girlfriend, Emily, and I decided to move to Seattle for my new job at a tech startup, our skepticism was about to be shattered in ways we couldn't have imagined. The apartment we rented was advertised as a hidden gem with unbeatable prices in a trendy neighborhood near Capitol Hill. For a young couple just starting out, the deal seemed too good to pass up. The unit was small but charming, a cozy one-bedroom with hardwood floors, large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, and a balcony where we could enjoy our morning coffees. The rent was incredibly affordable, even by Seattle standards, which made it all the more appealing. On our first night, we unpacked our belongings, laughing and reminiscing about our old apartment in Chicago. The place felt welcoming, and we were excited to start this new chapter together. As the evening settled in, we decided to watch a movie on the living room sofa. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional distant sounds of traffic and the soft hum of the refrigerator. A few days into our stay, the strange occurrences began. It started with the windows. Late at night, just as we were drifting off to sleep, the windows would inexplicably open on their own, letting in the cool Seattle breeze and the faint sounds of the city nightlife. At first, we thought it was a malfunction or perhaps a draft, but the windows always closed themselves shortly after opening, leaving no trace of forced entry. One particularly chilly evening in early December, Emily and I were getting ready for bed when we noticed a series of long, jagged scratches running down the wall of our bedroom. The marks were fresh, their dark lines stark against the pale paint. Confused and a bit alarmed, we inspected the window, but it was firmly closed. The scratches seemed too deliberate to be the result of anything accidental. We decided to chalk it up to our imagination and try to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was just the building settling or some tenant's mischief. However, the disturbances only escalated. Objects in the apartment began to move on their own. Emily's favorite mug would vanish from the kitchen counter, only to reappear in the living room hours later. Our phones would ring with no one on the other end, and the television would turn on by itself, flickering through channels without any input from us. The once cozy apartment now felt invaded by an unseen presence, and the tension between us grew as we tried to rationalize the events. The breaking point came one night when we decided to set up cameras to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. We rigged the cameras around the apartment, positioning them in the living room, bedroom, and kitchen. As we settled into bed, waiting for any unusual activity, a sense of dread settled over us. In the middle of the night, the phone rang, jolting us awake. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon streaming through the large windows. I reached out to answer the call, my hand trembling, but paused when I saw through the bedroom camera that Emily was already standing up, staring intently at something on the living room sofa. I followed her gaze, pulling back the curtains to reveal a shadowy figure sitting motionless on the sofa. The figure was indistinct, its features blurred and ethereal, but the sense of malevolence was unmistakable. My heart raced as I watched it remain there, staring directly at us through the camera lens. We exchanged terrified glances, both of us frozen in fear. Determined to confront the haunting, we decided to review the footage the next morning. As we watched the recordings, our worst fears were confirmed. The cameras captured the figure sitting on the sofa every night, its presence growing more defined with each passing day. It never moved, never spoke, but its mere existence filled the apartment with an oppressive energy that was suffocating. Desperate for answers, we delved into the apartment's history. Through old records and conversations with neighbors, we discovered that the previous tenant, a young woman named Sarah Thompson, had lived in the unit a decade earlier. According to local news archives, Sarah had been a struggling artist who battled severe depression. One winter night, overwhelmed by her despair, she had taken her own life in the very apartment we now called home. The revelation sent a chill down our spines. The scratches on the wall, the moving objects, and the shadowy figure all pointed to Sarah's restless spirit, unable to find peace after her tragic death. Determined to help her move on, we sought out a local medium who specialized in communicating with the dead. Her name was Madame Zara, a woman with an air of mystique and a reputation for her uncanny abilities. Madame Zara agreed to come and assess the situation. As she walked through the apartment, she immediately sensed a lingering sadness, a deep well of unresolved emotions that permeated the space. She explained that Sarah's spirit was bound to the apartment by her intense feelings of loss and despair, unable to let go of the world she had left behind. "We need to help her find closure," Madame Zara said, her voice both gentle and commanding. "Only then can she move on." Following her guidance, we began the process of creating a peaceful environment for Sarah's spirit. We cleaned the apartment thoroughly, removing any items that might remind her of her past sorrows. We also set up a small memorial in the living room with a candle and a photo of Sarah, honoring her memory and acknowledging her pain. One stormy night, as the wind howled outside and the apartment rattled with the force of the tempest, we felt the presence of Sarah more strongly than ever. The shadowy figure on the sofa seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, and the air was thick with sorrow. Madame Zara led us through a ritual to communicate with Sarah, encouraging her to express her lingering emotions and find peace. As we chanted the ancient words and lit the candles, the room grew colder, the shadows deepening and swirling around us. Suddenly, the figure on the sofa began to change. Its form became clearer, revealing the hauntingly beautiful visage of Sarah, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. She began to speak, her voice echoing through the apartment like a distant memory. "I can't move on," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need help." Tears welled up in our eyes as we reached out to her, offering words of comfort and understanding. "We're here for you, Sarah. Let us help you find peace." A surge of energy filled the room, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as Sarah's spirit began to dissolve, her form fading into the candlelight. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fading into a gentle breeze. "I can finally rest." As the ritual concluded, the apartment felt lighter, the once oppressive presence now replaced by a sense of tranquility. The windows no longer opened on their own, and the scratches on the walls seemed to vanish as if they had never existed. The shadowy figure on the sofa was gone, leaving behind only the soft flicker of the candle flame. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances ceased entirely. Our apartment, once a place of fear and unease, became a sanctuary of peace and love. Emily and I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that we had helped a lost soul find the closure she so desperately needed. The memory of Sarah lingered, a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of compassion. Years have passed since that harrowing winter, and our lives have settled into a comfortable rhythm. We moved to a new apartment, this time with a more thorough background check, ensuring that our new home was free from any lingering spirits. But the experience left an indelible mark on us, a story we share with others who find themselves facing unexplained phenomena in their own homes. The apartment on Maple Street remains a silent witness to Sarah's story, a testament to the enduring power of empathy and the human spirit. If you ever find yourself renting an old piece of furniture or an antique mirror, remember the story of Sarah and the importance of listening to the whispers of the past. For in the quiet corners of our homes, there are countless souls yearning to be heard, their stories waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek the truth. Story number 2. Reflections of the Forgotten. Winter in Florida was an oddity, especially in my small coastal town of Clearwater. While most people eagerly awaited the warm embrace of summer, I found solace in the cooler months, a brief respite from the relentless sun and the bustling tourist season. As a university student juggling classes and a part-time job, my budget was tight, and finding an affordable studio apartment felt like winning the lottery. When I stumbled upon a listing for a modest unit on Harbor Lane, I knew it was the perfect fit. The apartment was small but charming, with hardwood floors that creaked underfoot and large windows that offered a panoramic view of the marina. The building itself was old, with ivy climbing its brick facade and a quaint porch that hinted at stories long forgotten. As I signed the lease, the landlord, Mrs. Ramirez, handed me the keys with a warm smile. "Welcome home," she said, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of kindness and something else I couldn't quite place. Eager to settle in, I decided to visit the local flea market the following weekend. Amidst the clutter of vintage furniture, worn-out books, and eclectic trinkets, one item caught my eye, a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was intricately carved with floral patterns and what appeared to be faint, ghostly figures peering out from within. The mirror was surprisingly affordable, and despite its age, it exuded a certain charm that resonated with me. Without hesitation, I purchased it, imagining it as the centerpiece of my new living space. That evening, I hauled the mirror up to my apartment, the glass slightly dusty but still reflective. Placing it against the wall above my bed, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The room felt more complete, the mirror adding a touch of elegance to the otherwise simple decor. As I sat on my bed, admiring the reflection, a cool breeze fluttered the curtains, and the room settled into a peaceful silence. However, as days turned into weeks, an unsettling presence began to permeate my sanctuary. It started subtly. Small objects would be slightly moved from their usual places. My phone would disappear from the nightstand, only to be found dangling from the mirror's frame hours later. At first, I dismissed these incidents as forgetfulness or the result of my hectic schedule. But then, the disturbances became more pronounced. One night, after a long day of lectures and studying, I sat in my living room, exhausted and yearning for rest. As I gazed into the mirror, I noticed something strange. Behind my reflection, a shadowy figure lingered, its form indistinct and blurry. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light or a passing car reflecting off the glass. But when I looked again, the figure remained, staring back at me with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Heart pounding, I stood up, moving away from the mirror, but the feeling of being watched remained. I convinced myself it was merely a figment of my imagination, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by sleepless nights and mounting pressures. However, the incidents continued to escalate. Late at night, I would hear faint whispers emanating from the direction of the mirror, their words indistinguishable but filled with sorrow and despair. Determined to uncover the source of these disturbances, I decided to research the mirror's history. A quick online search revealed that the mirror had belonged to a family that had tragically lost their child decades ago. The story was shrouded in mystery, with rumors of the child's spirit lingering within the mirror, unable to move on from the untimely death. Skeptical yet intrigued, I reached out to Mrs. Ramirez for more information. Mrs. Ramirez listened attentively, her expression growing somber. "Oh, that mirror has quite a history," she said softly. "It belonged to the Martinez family. Their son, Luis, was just 5 years old when he disappeared one winter night. The family was devastated, and after that, no one wanted the mirror anymore. It was as if the mirror itself held onto his spirit, unable to let go." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The realization that the mirror might be more than just a decorative piece hit me hard. That night, armed with determination and a growing sense of dread, I decided to confront whatever presence was haunting me. I set up my laptop on the living room table, intent on recording any paranormal activity. As midnight approached, I settled into my chair, the room bathed in the soft glow of my desk lamp. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Minutes passed in tense silence until, just as the clock struck 12, the temperature dropped sharply. A thick fog seemed to emanate from the mirror, swirling in patterns that defied logic. The shadowy figure appeared once more, this time more defined, its form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. It raised a translucent hand, pointing directly at me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow wash over me. "Help me," the voice echoed, a haunting whisper that resonated in the depths of my mind. "Let me go." Terrified yet empathetic, I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the cool surface of the mirror. The moment my fingers made contact, the room was engulfed in blinding light, and I felt myself being pulled into the glass, as if the mirror was a gateway between worlds. I found myself standing in a dimly lit room, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and faded memories. A small crib stood in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. In front of it stood Luis, the boy from the mirror, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He looked up at me, his gaze piercing yet gentle. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stay here anymore," Luis replied, his voice tinged with desperation. "My family can't move on while I'm trapped in this place. Please, help me find peace." Tears welled up in my eyes as I knelt beside him, reaching out to offer comfort. "I'll help you, Luis. I'll find a way to set you free." The room began to shake, the walls groaning under the weight of unseen forces. Shadows danced menacingly around us, and the cries of other spirits echoed in the distance. "You must release me," Luis pleaded, his form flickering. "Release me from the mirror." Suddenly, The scene shifted, and I found myself back in my apartment, the mirror reflecting a distorted, nightmarish version of my living room. The shadowy figures loomed closer, their presence oppressive and filled with sorrow. I knew what I had to do. Determined to help Luis and free my apartment from the haunting, I began researching rituals and practices that could sever the ties between our worlds. Days turned into sleepless nights as I delved deeper into the occult, seeking guidance from ancient texts and modern paranormal experts. Each step brought me closer to understanding the mirror's dark power and the path to release. One stormy night, armed with candles, salt, and a heavy heart, I prepared to perform the ritual. The air was thick with tension as I arranged the candles in a protective circle around the mirror, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. I began chanting the incantations, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening and twisting as the spirits of the past began to stir. The mirror shimmered, and Luis appeared once more, his presence now accompanied by the wailing of other lost souls. "Release us," they cried in unison, their voices blending into a cacophony of despair. I continued the ritual, pouring all my will into breaking the mirror's hold. The air crackled with energy, and the spirits began to converge on the mirror, their forms becoming more defined and desperate. "We must let go," I urged, my voice rising above the haunting cries. "You deserve peace." A blinding light enveloped the room, and I felt a surge of power as the mirror began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface. The spirits screamed, their forms dissolving into the light as they finally found the release they had been yearning for. Luis reached out one last time, his form fading into a serene smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. As the final cracks formed in the mirror, it shattered into 1,000 pieces, the glass fragments sparkling like fallen stars. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a profound sense of calm and closure. I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but fulfilled, knowing that I had freed not only Luis but also my apartment from the lingering darkness. In the days that followed, the disturbances ceased entirely. The apartment felt lighter, the air filled with a newfound sense of tranquility. Laura and I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing we had helped a lost soul find peace. The mirror was gone, leaving behind only the broken shards as a testament to the ordeal we had endured. Years have passed since that harrowing winter, and I still live in the same apartment, now a place of warmth and happiness rather than fear and sorrow. Emily and Jake have grown, their laughter echoing through the rooms without the haunting cries of the past. Laura and I often reminisce about the events, grateful for the peace that now resides in our home. The experience taught me that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most unexpected places, and that compassion can bridge the gap between the living and the dead. If you ever find yourself renting an old piece of furniture or an antique mirror, remember the story of Luis and the power of empathy. For in the quiet corners of our homes, there are countless souls yearning to be heard, their stories waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to listen. Story number 3. Whispers Behind the Walls. I always thought moving to Texas would be a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the chaos of city life and embrace the quiet simplicity of suburban living. When my wife, Laura, and our 2 children, Emily and Jake, found the listing for the affordable apartment in a modest complex on Maple Street, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Little did we know, our dream home would quickly turn into a nightmare we couldn't escape. The apartment itself was nothing special, small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a modest living area. The rent was inexpensive, even for a place so conveniently located near schools and parks. The previous tenants had left abruptly, and Mrs. Henderson, the property manager, assured us there was nothing wrong with the unit. Relieved, we moved in during the first week of December, just as the chill of winter began to settle in. The first few nights were peaceful. We settled into our routines, Laura adjusting to her new job at the local library, while I took on extra hours at my desk job to make ends meet. Emily and Jake were excited about their new school and the spacious backyard where they could play. But as the nights grew longer and colder, an unsettling presence began to seep into our home. It started subtly. Late one evening, as I was working in the living room, I heard faint sounds of children crying. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or distant noises from nearby houses. But the sounds persisted, growing slightly louder each night, always emanating from the walls of our living room. Laura mentioned hearing it too, brushing it off as an overactive imagination fueled by the isolation of our new home. One particularly frigid night, the crying was unmistakable. It was a sorrowful, haunting sound that sent shivers down my spine. I decided to investigate, hoping to find a rational explanation. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of unease, I approached the living room walls. The crying seemed to come from within the very structure of the apartment, as if the walls themselves were weeping. Determined to uncover the source, I began to examine the walls more closely. The sounds guided me to a specific section of the living room wall, where the wallpaper was slightly peeling away, revealing the bare plaster beneath. My heart raced as I realized the crying was coming from behind it. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a hammer and chisel, ready to tear down the barrier that separated us from whatever lay hidden. With each strike, the wall began to give way, the sounds of crying growing louder and more desperate. Finally, a section of the wall collapsed, revealing a small, sealed-off room. The space was cramped, barely large enough to fit a child, and covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. Inside, I found old toys scattered across the floor, broken dolls, a dusty teddy bear, and a worn-out crib that still held a dusty, moth-eaten blanket. As I stepped into the hidden room, the temperature dropped sharply, and a heavy silence enveloped the space. It felt as though the air was thick with sorrow and despair. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something sacred, something that should have remained hidden. Reluctantly, I closed the door and returned to the living room, my mind racing with questions. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began digging into the apartment's history. Mrs. Henderson was surprisingly forthcoming, sharing that the previous tenant, a man named Thomas Whitaker, had lived alone in the unit a decade ago. According to old records and faded newspaper clippings, Thomas was a quiet, reclusive individual who had suffered from severe depression. His son, Danny, had passed away mysteriously at the age of 5, and shortly after, Thomas had taken his own life, leaving behind a series of unsent letters and abandoned toys. The revelation sent a chill down my spine. It became clear that Danny's spirit was trapped within the walls, unable to find peace after his untimely death. The crying we heard each night was his desperate attempt to reach out, to be remembered and acknowledged. The hidden room was his sanctuary, a place where his father had tried to hold onto his memory, only to be consumed by his own anguish. Laura and I decided we couldn't leave our children in this haunted environment. The presence of Danny's spirit was too strong, too intertwined with the apartment itself. We began searching for ways to help him find peace, hoping to break the cycle of sorrow that bound him to our home. Consulting with local historians and paranormal experts, we learned about rituals and ceremonies that could help release trapped spirits. One cold December night, armed with candles, salt, and a deep sense of empathy, we prepared to perform a ritual to help Danny move on. We returned to the hidden room, the air thick with anticipation. As we began the ceremony, the atmosphere grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted further. The crying started again, louder and more intense, as if Danny was resisting our efforts. We continued, speaking softly, offering words of comfort and remembrance. Slowly, the crying began to fade, replaced by a gentle silence. A warm, comforting presence filled the room, and we felt a sense of relief wash over us. It was as though Danny's spirit was finally finding the peace it had long been denied. As the ritual concluded, the hidden room seemed to transform. The toys were no longer abandoned but arranged neatly, as if Danny had been given a space to play once more. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a warm, inviting glow. We knew then that our efforts had succeeded, that Danny had been set free from his eternal confinement. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances ceased entirely. The apartment felt lighter, the air filled with a newfound sense of tranquility. Emily and Jake were happier, their laughter once again echoing through the living room without the haunting cries of the past. Laura and I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing we had helped a lost soul find peace. Years have passed since that harrowing winter, and our lives have settled into a peaceful rhythm. The apartment on Maple Street remains our home, a place filled with love and laughter rather than sorrow and fear. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a faint whisper or see a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, but these moments are rare and fleeting, mere reminders of the journey we undertook to bring peace to our home. The experience taught me that sometimes the past reaches out in the most unexpected ways, and that compassion and understanding can bridge the gap between the living and the dead. If you ever find yourself in a new place, listen closely to the whispers of the past, for you never know what stories lie hidden behind the walls, waiting to be heard and honored. Story number 4. The Ghost Upstairs. Winter in California is a peculiar thing. While much of the country grapples with biting cold and relentless snow, the Golden State wraps itself in a deceptive calm, its nights crisp but tempered by the mild embrace of the Pacific breeze. Yet, in my modest apartment in downtown Los Angeles, winter brought with it an unease that no amount of warm blankets or hot cocoa could dispel. I moved into the sprawling complex known as Evergreen Towers 6 months ago, drawn by the affordable rent and the promise of a vibrant community. The building stood tall amidst the urban sprawl, its architecture a blend of modern design and nostalgic charm. My apartment, on the 3rd floor, was small but cozy, with large windows that framed the city lights like a living painting. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were filled with the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of neighbors, while evenings offered solace in the quiet moments of solitude. I cherished my privacy, finding peace in the routine that my hectic job at a publishing house provided. Yet, as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, an unsettling presence began to infiltrate my sanctuary. It started subtly. At first, it was the sound of footsteps echoing from the apartment directly above mine. I would be reading a book or sipping tea, and out of nowhere, the soft thud of someone pacing or the faint shuffle of shoes would disrupt the silence. Assuming it was just another tenant going about their evening, I paid little mind. But as weeks passed, the footsteps became more frequent and more distinct. They weren't just random sounds, they followed a pattern, slow and deliberate one night, hurried and frantic the next. The uncertainty gnawed at me, a persistent shadow lurking just out of sight. Curiosity battled with unease, driving me to seek answers. One chilly December evening, after a particularly long day at work, I decided to confront the mystery head-on. I approached the building's management office, a small room tucked into the corner of the lobby, managed by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Caldwell. Her hair was always perfectly coiffed, and her demeanor left little room for pleasantries. "Excuse me, Mrs. Caldwell," I began, my voice tentative. "I've been hearing footsteps from the apartment above mine. Do you know who lives there?" She looked up from her paperwork, her expression unreadable. "The apartment above yours, Ms. Harris? That's Unit 312. It's been vacant for several years now." "A vacant apartment?" I echoed, confusion knitting my brows together. "I've never seen anyone there, but I've heard footsteps consistently for the past few months." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place, perhaps a hint of concern or a trace of old building lore. "Evergreen Towers has its share of stories, you know. But as far as records go, no one has rented that unit in years." Her words only deepened the mystery. How could an empty apartment produce such persistent noises? The logical part of my mind dismissed it as building noises or perhaps an old plumbing issue, but the unease remained, a stubborn knot in my stomach. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to investigate the vacant unit myself. That night, armed with a flashlight and a sense of trepidation, I made my way to the stairwell. The corridor leading to Unit 312 was dimly lit, the walls adorned with faded wallpaper and the occasional flicker of a faulty bulb. Each step I took seemed to amplify the silence, the only sound my own breath and the distant hum of the city below. Reaching the door of Unit 312, I noticed it was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling into the hallway. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, revealing the apartment in its current state, dust-covered furniture, layers of grime on the surfaces, and a pervasive sense of abandonment. Yet, amidst the decay, something was amiss. The air was thick with an inexplicable energy, and the temperature dropped noticeably, my breath visible in the cold air. As I stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness save for the beam of my flashlight. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of life, but found nothing, no signs of recent habitation, no personal belongings, just the remnants of a forgotten past. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the bathroom. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I approached the door, every fiber of my being screaming to flee. Summoning all my courage, I pushed the door open, expecting to find an explanation. But the bathroom was empty, only the cold tile and the mirror reflecting my pale, anxious face. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure standing by the bathtub. Its form was indistinct, almost transparent, yet its presence was undeniable. The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and a chilling realization washed over me: I was not alone. Frozen in fear, I watched as the figure began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace. It reached out, and as our hands almost touched, a burst of icy air enveloped me, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. In that instant, the apartment seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the air thick with whispers that filled the space with an unbearable tension. I stumbled backward, tripping over the furniture, and scrambled to my feet. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering sense of sorrow and despair. Panting and disoriented, I fled the apartment, the door slamming shut behind me with a finality that left no room for doubt. Breathless and trembling, I returned to my own apartment, the experience replaying in my mind like a broken record. The footsteps, the shadow, the whispers, they all pointed to a story untold, a tragedy long buried beneath layers of dust and time. Determined to find answers, I delved into the building's history, uncovering a tale that sent shivers down my spine. Unit 312 had once been home to Eleanor Mitchell, a young woman who had lived alone in the apartment in the late 1970s. Reports from neighbors painted a picture of a reclusive artist, struggling with depression and isolation. One winter night, Eleanor was found dead in her bathroom, the official cause of death listed as suicide. However, whispers of foul play and supernatural occurrences began to circulate, suggesting that Eleanor's spirit had remained trapped within the walls of her lonely abode. Armed with this knowledge, I sought out Mrs. Caldwell once more, hoping to gain more insight. "Mrs. Caldwell," I began, my voice steadier this time, "I need to know more about Eleanor Mitchell. The letters say she lived here in the late 70s and she died in Unit 312. Mrs. Caldwell sighed, her expression softening. Eleanor was a troubled soul. She kept to herself, rarely interacting with neighbors. Her disappearance was a mystery, and when her body was found, it only deepened the enigma. Some say she was driven to madness by the isolation, while others believe something more sinister occurred. Since her death, we've had reports of strange noises and unexplained phenomena in that unit, but nothing concrete. Her words only fueled my determination to help Eleanor find peace. I returned to Unit 312, this time armed with tools for a more thorough investigation, candles, salt, and a voice recorder to capture any lingering energies. As I entered the apartment, the same chill greeted me, but this time, I felt a resolve to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. I lit the candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. Placing the salt in a circle around me, I began to speak, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "Eleanor, if you're here, I want to help you. I know you're trapped, and I want to set you free." The air grew thick with anticipation, and the temperature plummeted once more. The shadows seemed to dance with a life of their own, and the whispers grew louder, forming words that echoed through the room. "Help me," the voice pleaded, a mix of desperation and sorrow. "I can't move on." Summoning all my courage, I continued, "I understand your pain, Eleanor. You're not alone anymore. Let me help you find peace." Suddenly, the shadowy figure materialized before me, its eyes hollow yet filled with an indescribable longing. It reached out, and I felt a connection, a silent communication that transcended words. Memories of Eleanor's life flashed before my eyes, the loneliness, the artistic struggles, the final moments of despair. Tears welled up in my eyes as I extended a hand toward her. "You deserve to be free," I whispered, the weight of her suffering pressing against my heart. The apparition began to fade, its form dissolving into the light of the candles. "Thank you," it murmured, the voice now tinged with relief. "I can finally rest." As the last remnants of her presence vanished, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a serene calm. The temperature returned to normal, and the whispers ceased, leaving behind a profound silence that felt like a promise of peace. Exhausted but fulfilled, I left the apartment, knowing that Eleanor's spirit had found the release it so desperately needed. The disturbances ceased, and the footsteps that once plagued me were no more. The building seemed lighter, the air free of the sorrow that had once weighed it down. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal. I found myself more attuned to the subtle energies around me, a lingering sensitivity to the unseen forces that shape our existence. The experience with Eleanor taught me that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most unexpected places, and that compassion can bridge the gap between life and death. Evergreen Towers continue to stand tall amidst the ever-changing skyline of Manhattan, its walls now holding not just the stories of the present but the echoes of the past. Eleanor's apartment remained a symbol of the healing power of understanding and the importance of reaching out to those who cannot speak for themselves. Years later, I still visit Evergreen Towers, not out of necessity but out of respect for the spirits that reside within. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a faint whisper carried by the wind or see a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, a reminder that the unseen world is always present, intertwining with our own in ways we can scarcely comprehend. If you ever find yourself living in a new place, especially in a city as vast and storied as New York, take a moment to listen. Pay attention to the signs, respect the histories etched into the walls, and remember that sometimes the most haunting stories are those of compassion and release. For in the heart of the city that never sleeps, there are countless souls yearning to be heard, their stories waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek the truth. Story number 5. Whispers from the Mailbox. I never thought a simple apartment in Chicago could become the epicenter of my nightmares. When I first moved into the loft on Elm Street, it was the culmination of years spent hustling through a relentless cityscape. The rent was reasonable, the view of the skyline unbeatable, and the solitude I craved was finally within reach. Little did I know, solitude would become my greatest torment. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. I settled into a routine, working late nights at the publishing house, mornings spent savoring coffee on the balcony, and weekends lost in the pages of books that transported me away from the concrete jungle. The only oddity was the old mailbox that clung to the brick facade, its paint peeling and door slightly ajar, as if beckoning secrets to be revealed. It began subtly. Letters arrived in the mailbox, their envelopes plain and unsigned. At first, I thought them to be misdelivered mail meant for neighbors or perhaps old acquaintances I'd long forgotten. But as weeks turned into months, the letters became increasingly personal. They detailed mundane aspects of my life, my morning coffee routine, the way I folded my laundry, the exact time I left for work. Each letter ended with a chilling phrase, "We're watching." I dismissed it as a twisted joke or the work of a disturbed individual. After all, Chicago was a city of millions, and privacy was a luxury hard to come by. Yet, unease settled over me like a thick fog. The letters continued to pile up, their content growing more invasive. One evening, I found a letter placed directly on my desk, outlining plans I had never shared with anyone. My heart raced as I read it, the implications sinking in. Someone knew everything about me. Determined to uncover the truth, I set up a camera facing the mailbox. If someone was tampering with my mail, the footage would provide undeniable evidence. Night after night, I reviewed the recordings, hoping to catch a glimpse of the perpetrator. Most nights yielded nothing, just the sound of wind whistling through the city and the occasional honk of distant traffic. But then, on the fourth night, everything changed. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. The camera captured a faint shadow moving stealthily toward the mailbox. It was tall, its form barely discernible against the darkened backdrop of the building. The figure reached out, its hand brushing the envelope before slipping away into the night. My blood ran cold. There was no one else in the building, no signs of forced entry or struggle. The existence of an intruder was now undeniable. I confronted the situation head-on, scouring the building's history and reaching out to neighbors for any clues. Most dismissed my concerns as paranoia, but one elderly lady, Mrs. Jenkins, shared a story that sent shivers down my spine. She spoke of a tenant from decades past, a man named Harold Whitaker, who had vanished without a trace one bitter winter night. The only evidence of his existence were the letters he'd left behind, each one eerily similar to the ones I was now receiving. As the truth unraveled, the letters intensified. They no longer detailed mere routines, but hinted at deeper, more disturbing knowledge. One letter described a private conversation I had with a colleague, something I had never told anyone. Another referenced a dream I'd had weeks prior, its details exact. It was as if the sender existed in a realm where my thoughts were laid bare. Fear gnawed at me, but so did a desperate need for answers. I delved deeper into Harold Whitaker's story, uncovering fragments of his life, his struggles with depression, his reclusive nature, and the tragic night he disappeared. It was rumored that Harold had been obsessed with the idea of being watched, convinced that invisible eyes tracked his every move. Perhaps his spirit, unable to let go, had latched onto me, his presence lingering through the letters. One particularly cold night, the atmosphere in my apartment shifted. The air grew heavy, and an oppressive silence settled around me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the latest letter clutched in my hands. As I read the familiar phrase, "We're watching," a chill ran down my spine. The room seemed to darken, shadows lengthening unnaturally. My breath became visible, the cold seeping into my bones. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside my door. They were slow, deliberate, approaching with a menacing intent. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps stopped right outside. The mailbox door creaked open, and a faint, spectral figure emerged, Harold Whitaker, or what remained of him. His eyes were hollow, voids of endless despair, and his presence exuded a sorrowful anger. "We're not done," he whispered, his voice a mere breath against the silence. "You need to know." Before I could respond, the apparition dissolved into the air, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. The camera captured nothing further, only the oppressive stillness that followed. I knew then that Harold's spirit was bound to me, compelled to share his unfinished story. Determined to break free from this haunting connection, I sought out paranormal experts and spiritual mediums, hoping to appease Harold's restless soul. But each attempt only deepened the mystery, the letters continuing unabated, their messages growing more urgent and cryptic. It was as if Harold was trying to communicate something crucial, something that could set him free. One night, amidst the relentless onslaught of letters and apparitions, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment in my closet. Inside, I found Harold's old diary, its pages yellowed with age. As I read through his entries, a horrifying revelation emerged. Harold had discovered an ancient ritual, a way to make his presence felt beyond the physical realm. But the ritual had gone wrong, trapping his spirit in a limbo of eternal torment. The final entry was a desperate plea: "If you find this, help me. I can't move on. I'm trapped between worlds, my mind unraveling from the darkness." Armed with this knowledge, I attempted the ritual described in the diary, hoping to release Harold's spirit and end the nightmare. The process was intricate, requiring a blend of ancient chants and symbolic offerings. As midnight approached, I prepared the space, heart racing with a mix of fear and hope. The room grew cold, the shadows dancing with an eerie life of their own. I began the chant, my voice trembling as I spoke the ancient words. The air thickened, and the letters fluttered around me, as if the very walls were trying to resist the ritual. The atmosphere became electric, charged with a palpable tension. Suddenly, the apparition of Harold Whitaker materialized once more, his form clearer than ever. "Why do you help me?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the apartment. "What do you gain?" "I want you to be free," I replied, holding on to the resolve that had driven me this far. "You deserve peace." Tears welled in his spectral eyes as he began to fade, his form dissolving into the ether. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a profound silence. The letters stopped, the shadows receded, and the haunting presence that had plagued me for months was finally gone. I packed up my belongings and left the apartment, the experience leaving an indelible mark on my soul. Chicago, with its endless lights and restless spirits, had shown me a glimpse into the unseen world. The memory of Harold Whitaker lingered, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. Years later, I still live alone, but the apartment on Elm Street remains empty, a silent witness to the tragic tale of a man who sought connection beyond the realms of life. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a faint whisper carried by the wind, a reminder that some stories never truly end, they just await the right moment to be told. If you ever find yourself renting an apartment in Chicago, pay attention to the whispers in the night and the shadows that linger longer than they should. For in the heart of the city that never sleeps, there are countless souls yearning to be heard, their stories etched into the very fabric of the urban sprawl, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Story number 6. Shadows in the Manhattan Flat. I never believed in ghosts. Growing up in the bustling heart of Chicago, surrounded by the constant hum of life, the idea of spirits lingering in the shadows seemed more like a page out of a horror novel than reality. But when I moved to Manhattan, seeking a fresh start after a tumultuous breakup, my skepticism was about to be shattered in ways I couldn't have imagined. The apartment I rented was a modest one-bedroom on the 12th floor of an older building in the East Village. It was charming in its own way: hardwood floors, high ceilings, and large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city lights. The rent was reasonable, especially for such a prime location, and the landlord, Mrs. Langley, seemed kind enough, her warm smile making the small space feel welcoming. The first few weeks were blissful. I immersed myself in my new job at a publishing house, explored local coffee shops, and reveled in the anonymity that only a city like New York could provide. The apartment became my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind after long days and nights filled with deadlines and endless revisions. But as winter approached, something began to change. It started subtly: small things like misplaced items and objects moved from their usual spots. At first, I dismissed them as the inevitable chaos of daily life, the result of my hectic schedule and scattered habits. But then, the changes grew more pronounced. One chilly December evening, I returned home later than usual, exhausted and eager to collapse into bed. As I walked through the living room, I noticed that the vase I had placed on the coffee table the night before was now sitting on the windowsill. Puzzled, I picked it up, examining it for any signs of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of unease lingered. Over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent. My favorite books would disappear from the shelves, only to reappear in drawers or under the bed. Mirrors would have faint streaks that hadn't been there before, and the temperature in the apartment seemed to drop inexplicably during the night. One night, unable to shake the growing sense of being watched, I decided to stay awake, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. As midnight approached, the apartment was enveloped in an eerie silence, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic and the occasional siren. I sat on the edge of the couch, eyes fixed on the living room, waiting. At exactly 12 o'clock, a chill swept through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I felt a presence, as if someone, or something, was watching me. My heart raced, and I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound that might explain the feeling. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure standing by the bathroom window. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away. The figure was indistinct, almost transparent, but its presence was undeniable. It lingered for a moment before vanishing into thin air, leaving me trembling and breathless. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, but the room remained silent and still. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I delved into the apartment's history. Mrs. Langley was helpful, providing old rental agreements and any information she could find. But what I discovered sent a shiver down my spine. The previous tenant, a woman named Eleanor Thompson, had lived in the apartment in the early 1970s. According to old newspaper clippings and building records, Eleanor had been a struggling artist who battled severe depression. One winter night, overwhelmed by her despair, she had taken her own life in the very bathroom where I had seen the shadowy figure. The more I learned about Eleanor, the more I felt a connection to her pain. It was as if her spirit was trapped in the apartment, unable to move on, replaying the final moments of her life in an endless loop. The disturbances I experienced were her desperate attempts to reach out, to be heard and acknowledged. One particularly cold night, the tension in the apartment became unbearable. The air was thick with sorrow, and the weight of Eleanor's presence pressed down on me. I sat on the floor of the living room, holding a candle as a beacon of light in the darkness. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know you're here. I'm sorry for what happened." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The temperature dropped further, and I could hear the faint sound of sobbing emanating from the bathroom. Summoning all my courage, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. As I pushed the door open, the room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, shining its beam around the bathroom. The cold air stung my face, and the sobbing grew louder, more anguished. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, revealing the outline of a figure standing by the bathtub. It was Eleanor, her form barely visible, her eyes hollow and filled with torment. "I can't escape," she cried, her voice echoing through the room. "Please, help me." Tears welled up in my eyes as I knelt beside her, reaching out to offer comfort. "Eleanor, you're not alone. Let me help you find peace." The room seemed to pulse with energy as I held her hand, feeling a connection that transcended the physical realm. Memories of her life, the struggles, the loneliness, the pain, flooded my mind, and I understood the depth of her despair. I knew I had to help her let go, to free her spirit from the shackles of her suffering. "You're free now," I whispered, determined to give her the closure she so desperately needed. "You don't have to carry this pain anymore." A sense of warmth enveloped the room, dispelling the cold and the darkness. Eleanor's form began to shimmer, her expression softening as a peaceful smile graced her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fading into a gentle breeze. "Thank you for listening." As her presence dissipated, the apartment felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The disturbances ceased, and the air was filled with a newfound sense of tranquility. I sat back, overwhelmed by the emotional toll of the encounter, but also by a deep sense of fulfillment. Determined to honor Eleanor's memory, I took steps to preserve her legacy. I donated some of her old artwork to local galleries and shared her story with Mrs. Langley, who was moved by the depth of her struggle. The apartment, once a place of fear and sorrow, became a symbol of healing and understanding. Months passed, and the shadows that once haunted the apartment were replaced by the warmth of a new beginning. I found solace in the knowledge that I had helped a lost soul find peace, and in turn, I began to heal from my own wounds. The experience taught me that sometimes, the most profound connections are forged in the darkest of times, and that compassion can bridge the gap between life and death. Looking back, I realized that the haunted apartment was more than just a setting for a ghost story. It was a testament to the enduring power of empathy and the human spirit. Eleanor's presence was a reminder that behind every legend lies a truth waiting to be uncovered, and that even in the most desolate places, there is hope for redemption. If you ever find yourself renting an apartment in the heart of Manhattan, remember Eleanor's story. Pay attention to the signs, listen to the whispers in the night, and offer a hand to those who may be silently reaching out. For in the shadows of the city that never sleeps, there are countless souls yearning to be seen, heard, and understood. Story number 7. The Whispering Basement. I didn't think much of the listing when I saw it. Cozy one-bedroom with a finished basement, located in a quiet Ohio neighborhood, $600 per month. Cheap, for sure, but I was starting over, and my wallet wasn't exactly brimming with options. The landlord was a middle-aged man named Hank, the kind who barely looked up from his clipboard when showing me the place. He didn't linger long on the basement either. "Storage down there," he muttered, jerking a thumb toward the wooden door at the end of the hallway. His voice was casual, but I caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, drank a couple of beers, and collapsed on the couch. I didn't even think about the basement until the following afternoon when I decided to check it out. The moment I opened the door, a chill rolled up my spine. The air was damp, thick with a faint metallic tang like old pennies. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the sound echoing in the emptiness. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered erratically, casting shadows that danced on the cement walls. The basement was unremarkable at first glance. A washer and dryer sat in one corner, a pile of dusty boxes in another. But then I noticed the scratches. Long, jagged gouges ran down the far wall, as though someone, or something, had been trying to claw their way out. My stomach tightened. That night, I heard the laughter for the first time. It started as a faint chuckle, barely audible over the hum of my fridge. At first, I thought it was the TV, but when I muted it, the sound grew louder, deeper. It was coming from the basement. I didn't sleep. The next day, I called Hank. His phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message, asking if he'd ever heard anything strange in the house. He didn't call back. By the third night, the laughter had turned into whispers, low, urgent murmurs that seemed to seep through the floorboards. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. When I finally worked up the courage to open the basement door, the whispers stopped. I stared down into the darkness, my hand gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. The bulb flickered, then went out completely, plunging the basement into darkness. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak, even to me. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing up the stairs like a wave of malice. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart pounding. The next morning, I found claw marks on the inside of the basement door. I decided to do some digging. The local library had a dusty archive of old newspapers, and it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In the 1980s, the house had belonged to a man named Charles Redmond. The name sent a shiver down my spine. I'd heard it before. He was a serial killer, infamous for abducting his victims and keeping them locked in his basement for weeks before killing them. They never found all the bodies. That night, I dreamed of the basement. In my dream, I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the far wall. The scratches had multiplied, crisscrossing the concrete like a frantic message in an alien language. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadows. It turned slowly, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. When I woke up, the door to the basement was open. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my stuff behind. Hank didn't seem surprised when I handed him the keys. "Doesn't work out for everyone," he said, avoiding my gaze. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laughter. It's faint, carried on the wind, but it's there. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. The basement isn't done with me.